Well, it's great to have an opportunity to spend some time with you again in God's Word. We're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes, the first chapter, and I kind of hinted before in another lesson that we might do this. But as we look at the text here, there's some information. Excuse me a second, get my notes over here. Some information that we can look at that is very pertinent today, the same as it was some 3,000 years ago. The reality is the things in this world are the same yesterday as they are today, and the reality of sin is still here. The reality and consequences of life are here. Random chance and situation has a great deal to play in a lot of situations. Whether God's hand is providentially there or not, we could discuss that. But Ecclesiastes says, random chance has a play in things. So we won't be looking at the whole book, but allude to some of the things that you may have read through Ecclesiastes. But we're going to focus on chapter 1. So I invite you to get your Bibles. I'll be reading from the King James, and I invite you to get your Bibles and follow along with me. And as we look at Ecclesiastes and we think about the first verse of the first chapter, he's establishing the reality that he is a person in authority. He is a person of experience. He's a person of status. So in other words, you ought to listen to me. I know what I'm talking about, been there, done that. Here are my credentials, and that's the way he starts out. And anytime that you're dealing with some of the issues that Ecclesiastes deals with, as we look at today's philosophers or previous philosophers, if you study philosophy today, people are still looking from a human perspective, trying to exclude God, trying to come up with truth, trying to come up with answers to the human condition. And they come up with the same answers as Solomon did. Whenever you look at this physical world, excluding God from the situation, and when you look at Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and some of the poetries, and we're looking for, there's symbolic meaning there, and it's dealing with, like Ecclesiastes is dealing with the situation, the phrase under the sun is used. So it's dealing with temporal situations that are here on earth that we experience. And so some of the things that are said here could be misconstrued because it's not including the reality of eternity and focusing upon eternal thinking. It is focused upon wisdom of this world. And so as you look at the world by the world's own wisdom, you come up with the same kind of answers. You look at I remember several years back, and it's still a movement, but where there was the Goth movement or the Gothics, and you've got kids that are oftentimes extremely well read, extremely bright, and somewhat mature for their age, and they move in this direction of the Goth. You've seen, if you're not familiar with that, it's kids that you've seen with all types of black clothing, black makeup or whatever, and the word Goth it refers to a darkness. And so they have a dark perspective on things, and basically they see little meaning in anything in this world. Well, they could read Ecclesiastes and fall right into that same philosophy. Solomon, he was a philosopher. He was Ecclesiastes. He was a teacher or a preacher. And so he's come up with the observations of everything in this world is vanity. Everything is just foolishness. Everything is meaningless. Everything is futile. It is what it is, and there's nothing you can do about it. So Solomon comes up with this, and he begins this in the first chapter, and we'll look at that. But leading into that and thinking about philosophers, we all come into life, into situations with some pre-existing ideas. And these presumptions, as referred to in a logical approach to things, you all have some presumptions before you actually start thinking. If you've studied any philosophy, you've probably heard of Rene Descartes and his mindset of I think, therefore I am, and a lot of little spin-offs and jokes about it. But he came, and if you've got nothing but time and you don't believe in God and you're trying to figure things out, this is how foolish you can get. But he was questioning his own existence. How do I know I exist? And you would say, well, you are here, you nut, you hear me, you see me, I'll smack you in the head and you'll know I exist, that kind of mindset. But he's saying, no, this could be a dream. I mean, I could be a character in your dream, or you could be a character in my dream. And you start thinking, well, maybe, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Have we all not had dreams where, the things that we saw were very realistic? The things that we heard were extremely realistic? And you wake up and you're still in that state of trying to figure out, is this real or is it a dream? So he's saying, we all may be in a dream. The things that I see, the things that I smell, all the senses that I have, I can't trust those. Those are presumptions that they are valid, and I'm just saying I can't prove that they're all valid because I've had dreams that were not reality. So he comes up with the idea, I'm thinking, therefore I must exist. But he's not basing it upon his senses or the presumption that the senses are valid. So you have a lot of philosophers going a lot of different directions, just trying to prove their existence. And once they prove their existence, what's the meaning of life? What is truth? What is reality? What has purpose? What has meaning? And as we look at all these different philosophers and different people going different direction, when you do not have established a solid truth, absolute truth, as we have through Jesus Christ and the teachings of Christ, you go in all types of different directions. I've got a friend of mine that talks about the culture that we live in today, and he doesn't always bring in the perspective of God, but he uses the phrase, people have lost their moral compass. And I've been playing around the lake this last week, and you get on the lake at night or whatnot, or even the daytime if you're not familiar with the lake. And if you don't have a GPS or you don't have a bearing on where you are, north, south, east or west or whatnot, you get turned around and you don't know where you're going. And you may think you're going the right direction, but you're not. So without a moral compass, and the real compass, the absolute north, is as we're thinking in these nautical terms, it's Jesus Christ. He's the only thing that we can base our life off of to know absolutely what direction we're going in. But moving back into the time of Solomon, Solomon was a great man, very wise. He was the wisest man on earth and maybe the wisest man ever. And at that time, he was, if not the richest man on earth, one of the richest men on earth, and if not the most powerful man on earth, and even some say the most powerful man ever on earth. And we can debate all this, but the reality is Solomon was somebody. He had experience, he had wisdom, he had God's blessing, and so when he says something, you ought to listen to what he's saying. So here's what he's saying. Follow along with me as we start reading, and as we look at this and we think about people over time, people in general have asked the questions of time and what it means, and if they've had experiences, social experiences that have been bad, economical experiences that have been bad, health or relationship experiences that have been bad, or that have been good. What happens to even all these things that are good? Well, second law of thermodynamics, and just the mindset of everything on this earth is running down. And that's kind of what we're going to get into in just a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. So read along with me. We'll start in verse 1. It says, "In the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." So he's saying, listen, here's who I am. So he's giving credentials. And then he starts out, and basically we could read verse 2 and be done with it. And he kind of reiterates that even at the end in chapter 12. I can write books and books on everything that I know, but what's it mean? But he says, in verse 2, he says, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." So when we see the reality of who Jesus is in our life, we have meaning and purpose, even though when we look around the world, it's still full of sin, it's still full of the issues of sin. But we are looking beyond this world. So we look at Ecclesiastes and say, that's kind of a negative perspective on things. But if you're looking at it purely from a worldly perspective, what has everlasting meaning, eternal meaning in this physical world? And you start wanting to find meaning, love and relationships. Well, people die. People leave you alone. Well, what about wealth? What about power? you die. And it is passed on. All of these things that are by the world standard, what does it mean? You work hard, you gain, and then it's lost. So that's what's going on in Solomon's mind, is he's looking and measuring things by the standards. I apologize for that. I had an alarm going off. So as you look at this in verse 2, he's saying everything in this world is vanity. Everything in this world is just foolishness or meaningless or futile. Some of the verses there and some of the commentators will tell you the actual meaning of the word could be literally translated as everything is like a vapor. It doesn't have shape. It doesn't have form. It's not something you can hold on to. It's just something that just disappears. The harder you try to grab it, the more it dissipates. And as we look at the physical things in this world, though they're concrete, how do you hold on to them? And, well, you can't, because we'll all leave this world. So we see in verse 3, he kind of changes perspective in a little bit, because he's dealing with the reality everything in this world is, or everything under the sun, as the phrase that's used so often, it leaves you wanting. Once you acquire it, you're still looking for something else, because it didn't feel that want or that need that you think that you have. And if you get this, then you want that. And when you get that, then you want something else. And it's perpetual. And verse 3, he says, what profit hath a man if all his labors which he taketh under the sun? So no matter what you accomplish in life, what does it really mean? We've known of people that have great wisdom, great abilities to understand things, but yet trying to convey that to someone else, it's very difficult to get them to understand or even to want to understand. Or great wealth. You've worked to achieve great wealth. You've tried to be a good steward, and you pass it down to your children. What if your children are not frugal or not wise? In 6 months, what you've worked a lifetime for, they've thrown away. You hear of all these people that win the lottery. No, I'm not promoting that, but just as a point of reference, people that win millions of dollars, and they were in financial trouble when they win this, and they're just so excited, they're thankful, all of their troubles have been solved. And what happens within 6 months to a year? They're in worse financial shape than they were when they won the lottery. Well, that's the ways of this world. And without God and his wisdom, things are meaningless. Without understanding there is a God and we're blessed by him, all these things become meaningless. So as we read down into the first chapter, he mentions this and brings this idea about, even in verse 4 as we're looking there. He says, one generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. As we think about that and the philosophy, I've got a little reading that I want to read here, and some of you may be entertained by this. Some others may think, what are you thinking reading this? But I'm going to read it anyway and let y'all have your own opinion on it. This is not Bible, but this would maybe relate to modern day philosophy, even earlier day philosophy. So let me read this to you. It says, ticking away the moments that make up a dull day, fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way, kicking around on a piece of ground in your hometown, waiting for someone or something to show you the way. Tired of lying in the sunshine, staying home to watch the rain. You're young and life is long, but there is time to kill today. And then one day, you find 10 years have gone behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. So you run and you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, racing around to come up behind you again. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shorter of breath, and one day closer to death. Every year is getting shorter, never seems to find a time planned that either comes to naught or half a page of simple lines, of scribbled lines. Hanging on the quiet desperation is the English way. The time is gone, the song is over, though I thought I had something to say. Pink Floyd, if you're not familiar with that. And you're saying, what, you've lost your ever-loving mind. And maybe I have, but to me, that song reflects exactly what Ecclesiastes is saying in these next few verses, reflecting upon how futile time is. And if you don't have God, in the last part of the song, and reading that, it says, home, home again. I like to be there when I can. When I can come home, cold and tired, it's good to warm my bones by the fire. Far away across the field, tolling on the iron bell, calls the faithful to their knees to hear the softly spoken magic spell. People that don't know God look at religion, as that is alluding to in the last part. People of faith coming together and just looking for some magic trick to make them have meaning. They discard, they throw away truth because they see it as foolishness. And the very foolishness that could give them any perspective on the troubles they have, they dismiss. And we see this going on in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, 1 Corinthians 1, 20 through 25, but specifically in 1 Corinthians 1:20, Paul asked the question there, where is the wise? And then he follows up in verse 21. And their wisdom has made them ignorant of God's ways. And that's my paraphrase. I encourage you to go back and read that. But you think about the people that are so smart today, and they want to dismiss God, faith, truth, or absolute truth. And all this is just foolishness. But look what they're depending upon. Even more foolishness and the complete emptiness of what they depend on. There's no purpose. There's no meaning there. Solomon went through everything that he did. In Ecclesiastes 1, he talks about him following after wisdom, following after all the things that are wise, and trying to be a good student where he could be a good teacher to tell everybody what's going on. And he basically, after the end of that, I'm getting ahead of the lesson, we'll follow up in a second, but he basically says, what's the difference? Whether you're wise or whether you're a fool, you end up dead. And, whether you're a wise or a fool, you still have the same heartaches in this world. You may have less if you're using wisdom. He makes the point that it's better to live in the light than it is to live in the darkness. Although people in the darkness, if you're sitting in a room and there's an angry grizzly bear beside you and it's dark, you don't know what's coming, you're going to be happy as a lark. Ignorance is bliss. So the argument could be made, it's better to be ignorant and not know what's coming at you. But the reality is it's better to know and better to prepare. Even though you can't make a big difference temporally, we can eternally. So getting back to the text there and the reading, hopefully you can see how the reading of Pink Floyd ties in with this. If you're not a fan of Pink Floyd, then I apologize for taking your time there. But he says there in verse 3, read along with me 3 through 5, it says, what profit hath a man of all his labor which he has taken under the sun? One generation passeth away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. In other words, people come and go, but it's still the same world. Names and faces and places may change, but it still remains the same. And then he goes on to say in verse 5, the sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteneth to the place where he arose. So the same old cycle, the sun goes up, the sun goes down. It's the same thing, but yet we get older and older and finally pass away. So the mindset of what's going on here is the same mindset that people have had for millennium. The futility of existence in this world. What does it mean? If you work hard or if you don't work hard, you don't get to reap the benefit of hard work, or you don't get to reap all the consequence of not doing hard work. There's some people with the philosophy, they spend everything they possibly can, borrow everything they possibly can, and die with the biggest amount of debt that they can possibly have, and then somebody else can worry about it. Well, what kind of life is that? But people think they figured it out. Solomon takes the same idea of trying whatever could possibly bring pleasure in chapter 2. And he comes to the same conclusion that it's all futile, it's all meaningless. But back to the text in Ecclesiastes 1, he mentions here, and these are some of the insights as we read God's word, and we think we're so smart in what we've discovered in the last century or so, and even there are people today, even as earlier times, think they've got all the answers, but they don't know God, so oftentimes their answers are very short-sighted or very limited. Sometimes they get it right if they're humble and they're looking at the facts and they're trying to find what is true. They get it right. But we see here Solomon makes this statement in verse 6. He says, the winds go toward the south and turn about to the north. It whirls about continually, and the winds return again according to his circuit or circuits. So we today, if you look at that, the jet stream is what he's talking about here. He goes up and down. You watch the news, you probably heard them talk about the jet stream. Well, the jet stream was officially discovered in the 1920s by Washiburo, and I may not be pronouncing the name, but Washiburo Owasi, who was a Japanese meteorologist, and he started flying balloons, and they'd fly up in between the troposphere and the stratosphere, and the differences of temperature and the convection currents that are going on there. He discovered the flows of the jet stream. And he didn't actually name it the jet stream. It was a German meteorologist that coined the term jet stream back in the 1930s, I think 1939. But anyway, the point is, Solomon's writing about what they discovered, less than a century ago, officially. And he goes on to talk about even the water cycle. Verse 7, it says, and all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. We have Amos, referring to the water cycle. We got Job referring to the water cycle. All these things that we see as scientific knowledge and discovering. The Bible is full of these things. Well, Solomon had made it a point to become very knowledgeable of everything. He makes that even in this text, as we'll read in a second. And so he's looking at the things that he has observed, and it used to be philosophy was considered a science, and before it abandoned the perspective of truth and absolute truth, and that's a whole nother discussion. But it was considered a science, and still is by some, because the word science means knowledge. Philosophy means a lover of knowledge. So if you're truly looking for knowledge, you're going to discover the truth. But if you go into the equation with some, presumptions about certain things, if you presume there is no God, you're going to come up with a lot of different answers, and they're not going to be aligned. If you presume there is a God, you're going to come up with answers that are aligned. And it's amusing to see the difference. If you're actually looking for truth, you can see how people without the concept of truth are all over the place. And the people that believe in absolute truth, it all stacks up. It all fits together. It makes sense. And when it doesn't, there's honesty there and says, this doesn't make sense. It's not fitting. And oftentimes later, people discover a missing piece that makes it all look right or make sense. But back to the reading. In verse 8, it says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. So what's he saying in verse 8? Life is so full of work. I mean, what do you get out of life unless you're working at it? You get what you pay for. You get what you invest in. If you're heavily invested, you get a lot back from it. If you put a lot into something, you get a lot back from it. At the same time, from the pessimistic perspective, what you get back from it, that's about the only thing there is. As Solomon concludes, about the only meaningful thing in life is to be able to eat and drink and to be merry and to celebrate, the profits of your labor, the fruits of your work. And that's about the only thing that may give you any meaning in this world. But he says even that's vanity because it doesn't last. I mean, you can celebrate and then it's gone. It's futile. Everything in this world is vanity. So talking about the work, everything's required of work, and you can't explain what work is unless somebody goes through it. I've had a few experiences that I can tell you about. I was thinking about what experience I could bring about. I've got a friend that frames houses, and he was bumping a framing pneumatic hammer, and as he was holding something up in place, and when he bumped it, it kicked back, and he bumped his hand. He nailed his hand as he was framing. Now you go, oh. Well, you can go, oh, but until you've nailed your hand to a piece of lumber, you really don't get the whole perspective. I drilled a hole in my finger. I was stabilizing a piece of a steel bit, and the bit broke and went through my finger. Drilled a hole clear through the bone. Well, ooh, that hurts. Well, yeah, it hurts, but you really don't know how much it hurts until you drill a hole through your finger. And then, you kind of got a perspective. Well, this is what he's saying. With life, and you're dealing with life, there's some, you can talk to your blue in the face. It's like raising children. It's, you can talk to your blue in the face trying to help your kids to get a perspective on something. But when they get it, when they hit that brick wall that you've been warning them about. And, most of us are the same way. People give us counsel and we think we get it, but we really don't. There's not words to fully make us understand that. And this is what Solomon is saying. There's nothing, man cannot utter it. He goes on to say the eyes are not satisfied with seeing, nor the ears are filled with hearing. You can see all of it. Whatever you can see, you want to see more. It's like fireworks. Everybody loves to see the fireworks until it's over. And then, you want to see more. Or, it's just recently what's been going on. And we look at this, that's the way our life is. We can't ever hear enough or see enough. In verse 9 it says, the things that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. As we look at the perspective there, all things in this world require works. We look there in verse 8. Words can't describe things. You can't teach people something. You try to. But in verse 9 and 10, we see basically he's saying, it's the same old, same old. You hear that phrase? That's what this world is. It doesn't matter what year you were born. If you're 1,000 years, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, when you start looking at what life is, it's vanity. It's empty. It leaves you wanting. And sometimes we have pleasure. Sometimes we can drink in all the good blessings that God has given us. But that passes, and then you're ending up again with that emptiness. So the only thing that gives us purpose and meaning is the reality that something is beyond this world. And God has prepared a place. Jesus has gone now to prepare that place, and he's coming back for us. And there's so much comfort in that, and the reality of that truth. And here, what Solomon's dealing with is, like I said, just the temporal, the reality of the uglies of this world. And he's saying it's all vanity. So as we go back to the text and reading there's nothing new under the sun, whether now or in the future. And he makes this point. In verse 10, he says, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old times, which was before us. So, and he goes on in verse 11, he says, there is no remembrance of former things, neither is there any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. So what's he saying? Whatever you've gained, the knowledge that you've gained from one generation to another, it dissipates, it leaves. And, there's many things that I wish I'd asked my mom and dad. They were telling me about genealogy, who I was kin to, and cousin this and that. Now I wish I had them here to ask. Family, friends, different things, or just ask them, where did you put so-and-so, and they're not here. And that knowledge of what they had about family, friends, love, life, well, it's passed away. We've got to regain it, all over again. And what he's saying there, in the reality, these things are lost and forgotten. And all, like the scientific perspectives on things, all the discovery. I get so disgusted with History Channel. Here I go with ancient aliens again. I don't know if some of you are thinking that. But, God's word shows and reflects the reality of an intelligent human being. God created Adam and Eve. I see them as at 100% capacity. And they were very intelligent. And we see the law of increasing entropy in humanity. People now use 10 or 12% of their mental capacity at most. Well, think about 100% capacity. And that was Adam, that was Eve. And we've kind of dropped down from there. But we look at this, and every abilities, all the knowledge they had, it's lost from generation to generation. And now, because we are seeing people intelligent, we are saying they must have ancient aliens. Good night. When you don't have God as a perspective, what do you grasp onto to try to explain the obvious? And ancient aliens, evidently. But moving on, I digress. We started reading again there in verse 12. It says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are under heaven. This sort travail hath God given to the sons of men, and to be exercised therewith. So what's he saying? I had the power, had the authority to search out everything. So I did. He looked for all knowledge, all wisdom. Basically, he's saying he'd gained all that. And once he did, for what? Heartache. Barney Five, right? Polish my shoes, polish my badge, and for what? Heartache. And all of us have been there. You ever work so hard for something and you just know it's all going to be coming together perfect, and either it doesn't come together perfect, or it does and nobody pays it any attention, and you've put everything into it for what? Heartache. That's what Solomon's saying. That's what this world is. That's what life in this world is. It's just full of heartache. It's vanity. It's empty. He goes on to say in verse 14, as I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity, and a vexation of the spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. So what's he saying? He's basically saying we can't fix this messed up world. It's broke. We can't fix it. You can try, but and the more you know about it, the more responsibility you have. The more responsibility you have, then the more heartache you have. And so why even take the time and trouble to learn? But then he comes back and says, well, it's better to know than not to know, and some of the proceeding passages. So as we look at verses 16, the concluding text there, he says, lo, I'm come to great estate, and I've gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart hath great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is vexation of the spirit. So he says, I've put my life into figuring out the good and the bad, the crazy and the stupid. I know what that is. The good and the exceeding excellent. I know what that is. But what difference does it make? It's empty knowledge. I died. It all passes away. The next generation got to figure it out all over again. Or the last last chapter of Ecclesiastes in the book, he says, I can spend all my time writing all these books. I can write books. The libraries are filled full of books. How many people are reading them? And the ones that do, how many of those even understand what they're reading? And this is his point. It's vanity. It's all vanity. So in the last verse there, he says, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he hath increased knowledge, he hath increased sorrows. So how does this all come together? The last two verses. Let's go to the last two verses of Ecclesiastes. And this puts it all in perspective. Because if you just look at the world from the world's perspective, you just like, boo-hoo, woe is me. This is a bad, awful situation, and just boo-hoo, I'm sorry. And, we're living in a world where everybody thinks their bad experiences, they're special. My experience is unique, and it's not. Everybody deals with heartache. Everybody deals with work. Everybody deals with failure. Everybody deals with this world. And what is it? Vanity. It's all vanity. So how do you make it have any meaning? Why stay alive? What's the purpose of it all? The last two verses of Ecclesiastes brings it in perspective. Read along with me if you have your Bibles. In the King James, it says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. If you want to know what life's all about, the whole big picture, here it is. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Or this is the whole of man. This is what you were created for. This is your purpose, is to fear God and keep his commandments. You look at what works in this world, what is functional is when you follow what God has designed you to do. And when you do what God says don't do, or you don't do what he says to do, you have dysfunction. Look around. What do we have? Dysfunction. And why? Because people are not fearing God. They're not keeping his commandments. But the reality of whether you're keeping his commandments, ignoring the truth, or whether you are working faithfully, and you'll be told, thou good and faithful servant, Here is the reality. Verse 14, for God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. You know, if you do a good job, you work hard, and nobody notices in this world, God's keeping score. Don't worry about people on earth keeping score. God's keeping score. He knows what you've done. He knows why you've done it. And if you're living a good and faithful life and you're in a covenant relationship with Jesus Christ, heaven will be assured to you. If you're in this world and you think you're winning by cheating, lying, stealing, manipulating, and you just think everybody else is a chump, God's keeping score. He's going to make everything right. He'll give mercy to those that deserve mercy, and he'll give judgment to those that deserve judgment. I hope you're right with God, and if you're not right with God, you need to get right with God. Hear the gospel, believe the gospel, obey that gospel by confessing Christ, by repenting, by being baptized and receiving the remission of sins. And you can have that covenant that Christ died to establish for the whole world. But it only goes to those that faithfully obey his will. I've enjoyed talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed our time together. Until the next time, take care.